It was the summer of 2006, and I was 17, staying with some family friends in a small coastal town called Santa Teresa, just outside of Santa Barbara, California. My parents had moved out of state earlier that year, so I'd been staying with them for the last few months. It wasn't the worst situation. My family friends were nice, but it was still hard adjusting to living with them. I was just getting through it, trying to keep busy, and keep my mind off everything that had changed in my life. One warm evening, we decided to head out for a short camping trip. My family friends had rented a camper van, and we were going to spend the next few days at a local campground on the beach. I wasn't really feeling super enthusiastic, but I went along for the ride. Besides, the beach wasn't too far, and it seemed like it would be a nice way to escape the usual routine. There were a few of us on the trip, me, my family friends, and their 2 kids. The younger daughter, Sophie, was around my age, and she was always pretty easygoing, though a bit more outgoing than I was. Sophie's boyfriend, Matt, also came along, as well as his buddy, Kyle. Kyle was in his mid-20s, a bit older than all of us, but he was one of those guys who just seemed to float in and out of our lives without much thought. He was there, then he was gone, you know? Sophie and Matt, though, were attached at the hip, literally all the time. The trip started off like any other camping trip. Peaceful, laid back, and easy. We set up camp, made some hot dogs and s'mores, and just hung around. But I wasn't the type to just sit and chat all night. So as the evening grew late and the campfire burned low, I slipped into the camper for some time alone. The camper had a small, cramped sleeping area in the back, where I had claimed the bed for myself. It was a simple, basic setup with a few blankets and a window that, if you opened it just right, gave you a perfect view of the stars above. At some point, the firelight outside flickered out, and I was lying there in the dim light of the camper, trying to fall asleep. Sophie was supposed to be in the bed across from mine, but I knew she wasn't. She'd snuck out earlier with Matt to hang out at his tent on the far side of the campsite, probably making out or whatever people in relationships do when they're alone. It didn't bother me much, though it made me a bit uncomfortable at the thought. I wasn't really tired yet, and I started to toss and turn in the bed. The camper was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt thick and heavy, and I had to pee. The camper's bathroom wasn't hooked up, so we had to use the public bathrooms near the main office of the campground, which wasn't too far away. I figured it was a good excuse to get some fresh air. It wasn't too late, and the campground seemed quiet enough. I grabbed a hoodie, stepped out of the camper, and walked into the night. The air was warm, but with just the right chill, like the kind you'd expect on a summer evening by the beach. I wasn't worried. The campground felt like a safe place. There were no strange noises or anything out of the ordinary. I could hear the waves crashing lightly in the distance, just a soothing rhythm in the background. To my left, a gentle breeze whispered through the tall trees lining the paths, their shadows stretching long on the ground in the dim light of the street lamp. The walk to the bathrooms wasn't far, maybe 5 minutes tops, so I didn't mind the distance. It wasn't until I was passing the picnic area near the bathrooms that I noticed something strange. As I got closer, something caught my eye. There, sitting hunched on the bench of one of the tables, was a man. An older man with skin that looked wrong. He was crouched rather than sitting, and his skin was a sickly, pale gray. I thought for a moment that maybe it was just the moonlight making him look that way. But no, his skin wasn't just pale, it was unnatural. It looked almost dead, like it had no life in it at all. My heart began to pick up speed. I wasn't sure what it was exactly, but something about him set my nerves on edge. He looked completely out of place, like he didn't belong there. But that wasn't the worst part. As I drew closer, I realized that he wasn't wearing any clothes. At first, I tried to look away, but something pulled my gaze back to him. He was naked, sitting in a crouch like some kind of animal, his body twisted in a way that felt wrong. But it wasn't just his body that caught my attention. It was his eyes. When he turned to look at me, I froze. I don't even know how to explain it, But the look in his eyes wasn't human. They weren't like normal eyes at all. His eyes were dark, sunken, with a strange gleam in them, like something was just off, like something wasn't quite right. For a second, I just stood there, unable to move. Then, as I locked eyes with him, I saw his lips curl up into a twisted, grotesque grin. The kind of smile you would never want to see on a person, let alone a naked, gray-skinned man crouched in the dark. His teeth were sharp, unnaturally sharp, and as he smiled, it felt like he was about to pounce. Couldn't breathe. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs were frozen. I don't know what it was, whether it was fear or something else, but I felt trapped in that moment. His eyes never left mine as I slowly began to back away, not daring to take my eyes off of him. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, but when my body finally responded, it was like everything snapped back into place all at once. I turned and ran faster than I'd ever run in my life. I didn't care about anything at that point, only that I needed to get away from him. I ran all the way back to the camper, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me and locking it. I was shaking, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Sophie wasn't back yet, but Matt had returned with Kyle. They looked at me, confused by my state, and I could barely form words. I remember muttering something about a naked old man with white skin. They both stared at me like I was crazy. Kyle laughed it off, thinking I was just overreacting, but Matt seemed to sense the genuine fear in my voice. He didn't say anything, but I could tell he was thinking about it. When Sophie got back to the camper, I was still rattled. I asked her if she'd seen anyone strange around the campground. She hadn't, of course. She looked at me like I was just being paranoid, but I didn't care. I was scared, and nothing she said would change that. The adrenaline was still coursing through my body, and I couldn't shake the image of his eyes from my mind. I tried to calm down, but it wasn't easy. The rest of the night was quiet, and the morning came without incident. We tried to put the whole thing behind us, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The following day, we asked around the campground, hoping to find someone who had seen him, or maybe had any explanation for what I had encountered. But no one had seen him. No one had heard anything strange. By the time the trip ended, the whole thing felt like a nightmare, like something I couldn't explain away. There were no more incidents, no more strange sightings, but that feeling, that fear, that something wasn't right, never left me. I couldn't forget the look in his eyes, the smile that didn't belong on a human face, and the chilling thought that I had narrowly avoided something far worse than I could imagine. I've never gone camping at that place again, and I never went anywhere at night without someone else. What I saw that night still bothers me, and it's something I'll never fully explain, no matter how many years pass. It feels like a shadow that follows me, one that I can never escape. And to this day, I wonder if that man was ever real, or if he was something else altogether. It was late October when we decided to go on a dispersed camping trip. I was 26 at the time, and my girlfriend, Sarah, was 24. We weren't planning on going anywhere fancy, just some backcountry spots in the mountains a couple of hours from home. We'd been hiking together before, but this time we wanted to go deeper into the woods, away from the crowds. We didn't need any fancy campsites with picnic tables and fire pits. Just the raw outdoors, the kind that's untouched and as wild as you can get without being in the middle of nowhere. The idea of not being surrounded by other people, of being completely isolated, appealed to both of us. The plan was simple. We'd hike up to a spot by a small creek, set up camp, and spend the next couple of days just relaxing, cooking meals over the fire, and enjoying the peace and quiet. We packed in everything we needed: food, sleeping bags, a tent, a small stove, and, of course, the essentials. Sarah had recently bought a new collapsible shovel, which she was excited to test out, but we didn't really talk about it much beyond that. We arrived at the trailhead just before noon and started hiking up. The air was crisp and cool, the leaves on the trees almost at their peak, turning vibrant reds and yellows. As we climbed higher, the forest grew denser, and the trail began to narrow. I carried the bigger pack, filled with the heavier gear, tents, cooking stuff, and food, while Sarah had the lighter load. We moved in silence for the most part, only breaking the stillness when I'd point out something interesting, like a rare type of mushroom or a particularly gnarly tree. After about 5 miles, we reached our campsite by the creek. The spot was perfect, isolated, tucked away between 2 ridges, with the sound of the water flowing over rocks adding a calming background noise. The weather had started to turn colder, with the wind picking up a little, but it didn't bother us. We were used to it. Setting up camp went smoothly, and by the time the sun started to set, we had our little fire going, roasting hot dogs and listening to the crackling of the flames. That night, the temperature dropped into the low 30s. The wind picked up, making the tent flap around a bit. I crawled into the sleeping bag and tried to get some sleep, but I was restless. The wind howled outside, and I couldn't help but feel a little exposed, like the wilderness was pressing in on us from every side. But I eventually drifted off. Around 2 a.m., I woke up. My stomach was in knots. I'd been feeling off all evening, but now it was urgent. The kind of urgent where you know you're in trouble. The cold air seemed to make everything worse. I had that deep, sinking feeling that I was about to shit myself if I didn't get out of the tent immediately. I fumbled around, trying to get my bearings, and shook Sarah awake. "Hey, where's the shovel?" I asked, my voice strained. Sarah, barely awake, mumbled something and pointed towards a crate near the corner of the tent. I couldn't waste time asking her to be more specific. I was in full-on panic mode now, the kind where everything feels like it's happening in slow motion, and the pressure in your stomach builds to the point of no return. I scrambled out of the tent, my legs stiff from the cold, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The wind had picked up even more, cutting through my clothes as I rushed to the crate. My hands were shaking as I threw open the flap, desperately searching for the shovel. The crate was filled with our gear: sleeping pads, cooking pots, a few spare jackets, and random odds and ends, and I could feel my stomach turning tighter, urging me to find the shovel to dig before I completely lost it. Felt like forever, but I finally found the damn thing. It wasn't the collapsible one I was expecting, though. Instead, I'd grabbed a small garden spade, the kind with a plastic handle and a cheap metal head. I almost threw it aside in frustration, but there was no time. I had to make it work. I hurried over to the edge of the camp, looking for a place to dig. The ground was hard, frozen even in some spots, and the wind bit into me with every breath I took. The spade barely scratched the surface, the metal edge scraping uselessly against the cold earth. I cursed under my breath, my panic rising as I realized just how impossible this was going to be. I knelt down, shivering from the cold and the pressure in my gut. My hands were stiff and trembling, but I forced myself to dig. I dug and dug, the cold seeping into my bones, until the ground finally gave way enough for me to squat down and do what I had to do. It wasn't pretty, but I managed to get through it, though not without a bit of a mishap. Just as I was finishing up, disaster struck. The spade slipped from my hand, and before I could catch it, I was already too late. I'd done it. I'd shit all over myself. The cold and the panic had clouded my brain, and the urgency had overcome my better judgment. I stood there for a second, just frozen, my face burning with embarrassment and frustration. I couldn't stay out there in the cold any longer. I turned around and made my way back to the camp, desperately trying to clean myself up. I hadn't brought toilet paper with me. Of course I hadn't, and I found myself looking around for anything I could use. My hands were covered in dirt from the ground, but I had no choice. I did my best to wipe as much as I could, but it wasn't enough. The cold water from the creek was my only option, so I trudged over to the bank and washed as best I could. By the time I crawled back into the tent, I was a mess. The smell of the cold earth lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling of how wrong everything had gone. Sarah was still asleep when I slipped back into my sleeping bag, shivering with cold and shame. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't quiet down. I kept replaying everything in my head. The panic, the mess, the cold, the feeling of being completely helpless in the middle of nowhere. The next morning, Sarah woke up before me, her breath fogging in the cold air as she stretched and rubbed her eyes. I tried to ignore her, hoping she wouldn't notice how off I was. But of course, she did. "You okay?" she asked, looking at me like she could tell something was wrong. "Yeah, I'm fine," I mumbled, not meeting her eyes. I didn't want to talk about it. I couldn't talk about it. After a moment, she pulled open one of the pouches of her pack, and that's when I saw it, the actual collapsible shovel. It was tucked neatly inside a small, zippered pouch, one I hadn't even noticed the night before. She showed it to me, a little surprised I hadn't seen it myself. "Guess I should have shown you where I packed it," she said. But she didn't sound mad. She didn't have to. I already felt like an idiot. I didn't want to look at the shovel. I didn't want to think about the whole mess again. But I had no choice. We packed up our camp and started the hike back down the trail. The cold air seemed to press in even more now, the wind biting at my skin as we made our way down the mountain. My stomach had calmed down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the wilderness had won this round. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was starting to come out, casting a weak light over the forest. I looked around, but everything felt different now. I felt exposed, like I had been caught out in the open, completely vulnerable. It wasn't the peaceful, beautiful experience I had imagined. It was raw, unfiltered, and unforgiving. It felt like the wilderness had a way of showing you just how small you are when you're on its turf. And as much as I wanted to forget about the whole thing, part of me knew that it wasn't something I could ever really shake off. The cold, the panic, the mess. It had all become part of that trip now. A reminder that even when you think you're prepared, nature can always throw something at you that you're not ready for. It was the summer of 2012, and I was a 26-year-old adventurer, fresh from a handful of successful solo hiking and camping trips. I'd spent the last few years testing my limits, building my confidence in the backcountry, and finding the peace I desperately craved in the quiet of the woods. Shenandoah National Park had always called to me. The rolling hills, the thick forests, the isolation. It felt like a world where nothing could bother me. No noise, no distractions, just me and the mountains. This time, I decided to take it a step further and camp solo in the backcountry. It was a plan I'd thought about for weeks, but I hadn't prepared myself for just how vulnerable I'd feel out there. I arrived at the trailhead just before noon. The sun was high, and the air was humid, typical for the midsummer Virginia climate. My pack was light, just the essentials. A hammock with a rainfly, a small stove, a first aid kit, a water filter, and food for 3 days. I was used to minimalist camping, but there was something different about the thought of setting up camp far from any other hikers. It felt like a step deeper into the wilderness, into a place where I was entirely on my own. The first day passed in a blur of trail and trees. I hiked for miles, the sounds of my boots hitting the earth and the occasional birdsong keeping me company. The beauty of Shenandoah was overwhelming. The trees were so thick that the sunlight barely reached the forest floor, and the scent of pine and earth mixed with the sweet, musty aroma of moss. I took my time, stopping to rest when I needed, but I was in no rush. I knew the area well enough to understand that getting lost wouldn't be an issue. By the time I found my spot to camp, it was late afternoon. I settled on a small, flat clearing near a creek, just far enough from the water to avoid the damp. My hammock setup was quick and easy. I strung it between two sturdy trees, unfurling the rain fly over the top. The guy lines stretched about 10 feet into the surrounding woods. It wasn't the most secluded spot, but I liked it. It felt open, surrounded by the deep forest, with a view of the creek just below. As I hung up my gear and set my camp stove to boil some water, a sudden chill washed over me, and I realized how isolated I truly was. My phone had no signal and the trail was miles away. It was just me and the forest now. The light was fading as I ate my meal, the sun sinking behind the mountains. By the time I finished eating, the stars had started to peek through the trees. I'd set up a small fire, but it was low, just enough to give me some warmth and light. It wasn't long before I crawled into my hammock, zipping up the fly around me, and settled into the soft fabric. The hum of insects and the rustle of the wind through the trees were soothing, and before I knew it, I was drifting off to sleep. But then, around midnight, something woke me. It wasn't a loud noise, but the kind of subtle rustling that you could almost convince yourself was the wind. However, it wasn't the wind. Came again, this time louder, moving closer. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, my senses sharpening. Something was in the woods nearby. My mind raced through all the animals I'd learned to expect in the area. Deer, raccoons, maybe a coyote. But then, another sound broke through the quiet, the unmistakable crunch of heavy paws on leaves. It was too large to be a raccoon. I held my breath, listening. The sounds were getting closer. Slowly, cautiously, I slid my hand under my hammock and gripped the Fox 40 whistle I'd brought along for emergencies. It had a shrill, piercing tone, meant to grab attention and disorient whatever creature was nearby. My other hand reached for the small, foldable knife that sat in my pocket. I'd never been one to carry much in terms of weapons, but out here it was either a survival knife or nothing at all. I felt exposed. No shelters, no walls, just a thin hammock and the dense woods. I strained my ears and could hear them clearly now. Two large creatures, moving through the underbrush. They were grunting, snuffling, and scraping the ground with their claws. Bears. Black bears. I could tell by the way the leaves and rocks shifted under their weight. They were rooting through the forest, moving casually but steadily, seemingly unaware of my presence. I'd read about black bears in Shenandoah before, how they were curious, often more afraid of humans than we were of them. But that didn't ease the anxiety rising in my chest. I was alone, completely exposed. The guy lines from my rain fly stretched into the woods, and I could hear them snapping and swaying as the bears passed by. They were close, very close now, and I couldn't help but imagine what would happen if one of them stumbled into the thin ropes. The last thing I wanted was for one of them to get tangled and lash out in confusion. They were at the 10-foot mark now, just a little beyond the edge of my camp. I could hear their breathing, slow and rhythmic. It was a sound that made my blood run cold. Each breath was deep, thick with the scent of earth and wildness. I didn't move. I didn't dare. They were flipping over rocks now, heavy boulders the size of basketballs. The bears were so strong, effortlessly tossing them aside in search of grubs, insects, or whatever else they could find. I could see their dark shapes shifting in the moonlight. The occasional glint of eyes caught the light, but it was impossible to know if they were aware of me. Time stretched out. I lay perfectly still in my hammock, every muscle in my body locked up with tension. My breathing felt too loud in my chest, too shallow. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I could hear the whistle in my throat begging to be used. But I knew the sound could provoke them. I'd read about how bears could react unpredictably if they felt threatened. But the longer I lay there, the more I imagined them discovering my food, or worse, mistaking my hammock for something to tangle with. Every rustle in the leaves felt like it could be the one that brought them charging toward me. Every heavy footstep on the earth felt too close. My hands clutched the whistle and the knife tighter, but I couldn't make myself use them. I was paralyzed by fear, unsure of what would happen next. A bear could wander into my camp, become tangled in the guy lines, and in the panic lash out violently. The thought was enough to freeze me in place. I lay there from midnight to about 2 a.m., the sounds of the bears never letting up. It was maddening. I could hear them breathing, snuffling, moving in the darkness like shadows. But they never came closer. They never crossed the invisible line that separated them from me. And after what felt like an eternity, the rustling began to fade. I could hear their steps getting quieter, moving further into the forest. Finally, silence. I waited a few minutes, unable to make myself believe that they were truly gone. I heard the faintest sound of a twig snapping off in the distance, and then another. It was over. The bears had wandered off into the night, leaving me alone in the woods. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I stayed awake, listening to the wind, the trees, and the occasional owl call. My heart wouldn't stop racing. But as the first light of dawn began to break, I started to relax. The tension drained from my body as the sun slowly rose, spilling light into the forest. I couldn't believe it was over, that I'd survived the night. I took a long breath and finally let the tension ease from my shoulders. Eventually, the day started again. The birds began singing, and the forest woke up, just like it always did. I packed up my gear and hiked out of the woods, my thoughts swirling with the night's events. The memory of the bears stayed with me, but so did the satisfaction of knowing I'd faced my fear and survived it. In the years that followed, I would occasionally find myself thinking back to that night. The fear I felt was still real, still raw. I worried about bears more than I ever had before, but over time, the anxiety faded. I found my confidence again, but something had shifted. I had been reminded of just how vulnerable we are in the wild, just how close the edge of danger really is. I still camp solo even now. The wilderness has become my sanctuary. But every time I set up my hammock in the woods, I can't help but think back to that night in Shenandoah. I've grown comfortable again, but part of me will always carry that moment with me. The night the bears came close. It was late September, and my wife, Kate, and I were preparing for a backcountry trip in Glacier National Park. We'd done a lot of hiking in the past, but this would be our first time in such an isolated area, far from the trailheads and parking lots. The weather had been unpredictable, but the forecast seemed clear for the next few days. We'd received our permits, which indicated a designated camping site, nestled among some sparse trees along a small ridge, about 12 miles into the backcountry. The trail had been relatively easy up to that point, mostly uphill but nothing we hadn't handled before. Still, we'd been carrying our packs for several hours, and the quiet of the wilderness felt different when you were so far from any help. It wasn't until we reached the camp spot that we started to realize just how remote we truly were. The campsite was situated next to two tall, dead trees. They looked ancient, their branches stripped away by time and weather, leaving just a skeletal frame against the clear sky. The ground around the trees was rocky and sparse with vegetation. Beyond that, it was wide open. Nothing but bushes, scattered rocks, and more dead trees. A desolate landscape, harsh yet oddly beautiful. We set up our tent quickly, choosing a spot well away from the dead trees, as if we could somehow avoid the inevitable. After gathering some firewood and boiling water for our freeze-dried dinner, we relaxed by the campfire, listening to the distant sounds of wind rustling through the trees, the occasional bird call, and the crackling of the fire. But as the evening wore on, the wind picked up. By the time the sun dipped behind the peaks, a chill had crept into the air. Kate zipped up her jacket and pulled her hat low over her head. I could tell she was feeling uneasy, but she didn't say anything. I thought it was just the usual feeling that came with being out there, always a little on edge when you're so far from civilization. We crawled into our tent around 9 p.m., tired from the hike. The sky was mostly clear, but the weather had begun to shift. The wind had intensified, and dark clouds were creeping over the mountains in the distance. It wasn't anything unusual, but it felt like something was about to happen. I remember lying there, listening to the rustling of the tent fabric as the wind howled outside. I tried to ignore the feeling of unease creeping in, but the trees, those two dead giants, stood ominously in the distance. I kept thinking about them, about how fragile our little tent was compared to the massive trunks of those trees. It wasn't long before I fell asleep, exhaustion finally taking over. But my sleep didn't last. At 4 a.m., I was jolted awake by a violent gust of wind that slammed against the side of the tent. I sat up, wide-eyed, my heart racing. The temperature had dropped sharply, and I could hear the wind howling through the trees, a sound that felt like it was coming from all directions at once. The tent shook violently, the rain suddenly pelting against the fabric in an angry rush. I glanced at Kate, but she was already awake, her eyes wide and fearful. Then the lightning hit. It was as though the sky had split open. A flash of light so bright it lit up every inch of the tent, casting long shadows that danced across the fabric. The thunder followed immediately, a deafening crash that rattled my teeth. I could feel the vibrations in my chest, as if the world itself was shaking. I grabbed Kate's hand, instinctively pulling her closer. The rain was now coming down in sheets, and the wind felt like it was going to tear the tent from the ground. Every crack of lightning made the trees surrounding us look even more threatening. The dead trees, the wind was pushing them harder, bending their skeletal branches like they were going to break off and fall. And we were right beneath them. I kept telling myself it would be okay, that the trees wouldn't fall, that we were safe, but every few minutes the wind would surge again, the tent flapping wildly and the trees creaking like they were groaning under the pressure. The storm was relentless, and I felt like it had swallowed up the entire world. The only light came from the lightning, and every time it flashed, I could see the outlines of the trees, standing tall and unmoving, just waiting to crash down on us. I tried to focus on the storm, but my mind kept returning to the trees. They were the only thing between us and the vast, open expanse of the wilderness. We were exposed, vulnerable. What would we do if one of those trees fell on the tent? There would be no one around to help us. No cell signal, no trail to run down. Just us, in the dark, at the mercy of the storm. The wind picked up again, and I could hear the trees groaning even louder. The lightning strikes were coming faster now, the thunder almost continuous. Each flash seemed to last forever, revealing more of the storm's chaos. The rain lashed against the sides of the tent, the sound deafening as it hit the fabric. I could feel the cold creeping in, seeping through the layers of our sleeping bags, making it impossible to get any comfort. I wrapped my arms around Kate, trying to steady my breathing, but I couldn't shake the fear in my gut. With each passing minute, the storm seemed to grow worse. I could feel the ground beneath us vibrating with every gust of wind. It was as if nature itself had turned against us, pushing us to the brink. I kept looking at the dead trees, convinced one of them was going to come down on us any second. We weren't far from them, and every time the wind screamed through the branches, I could hear them cracking, snapping in the distance. I checked the clock on my watch. It was 4:45 a.m. Time seemed to be stretching out, each second feeling like an hour. I tried to steady myself, to breathe, to think, but all I could focus on was the storm. The storm that felt endless. The storm that felt like it was trying to rip us from the earth. And then, for a moment, the wind died down, just enough for me to think we might be safe. But then the storm roared back, even stronger than before. The tent flapped violently, and the ground beneath us trembled again. I thought I could hear something from the trees, something that wasn't just the wind. It was a snap, followed by a long groan that seemed to stretch out forever. The tree, one of the trees had cracked. I froze. I couldn't move. I didn't even dare breathe. The wind howled even louder, pushing against the tent, making the fabric scream in protest. I could hear the cracking again, a horrible, sickening sound. Then a massive crash. The tree had fallen. I thought it was over. I thought that the next thing I would feel would be the weight of the tree crushing down on us. The tent collapsed on one side as the sound of the tree's fall echoed across the valley. But we weren't hit. We were still alive. I don't know how long I sat there in the pitch-black tent, listening to the storm rage on. But somehow we made it through. The winds finally started to die down, the lightning became less frequent, and the rain slowed. By the time the sky lightened with the first hint of dawn, the storm was over. We cautiously unzipped the tent and stepped outside, squinting in the morning light. The landscape had been transformed. The air was thick with mist, and everything was eerily silent. The two dead trees, the ones we'd been so afraid of, were still standing, but only just. One of them had snapped in half, its massive trunk now lying just a few feet away from where our tent had been. I don't think either of us said anything for a long time. We packed up our gear quickly, double-checking everything, eager to leave the site behind us. The wilderness was still beautiful in the light of day, but it felt different now. The danger, the terror was still fresh in my mind. We didn't talk much as we made our way back down the trail, but as we descended, I realized how close we'd come to disaster. The storm had been unforgiving, and for a while I thought we might not make it out. But we did. We survived. And the memory of that storm, the fear, and the relief of making it through, it stays with me. It's a reminder of how fragile we are in the face of nature's power. How, no matter how prepared we think we are, there are forces beyond our control. In the end, we made it out, and that was enough. I had been hiking through the Amazon for a few days now. The thick, hot air seemed to press in on me from all sides, making it feel hard to breathe. All around me, the jungle was alive with noise. Bugs buzzing, birds calling from far away, and the occasional rustling in the brush that told me something was moving nearby. I set up camp by a small stream, my tent pitched under the cover of tall trees. I tried to shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but it was there, heavy in my chest. It was like the jungle itself was watching me. That night, I sat by the fire, the flames flickering and casting long shadows around my camp. But then, I heard something strange. At first, it was just a soft tapping sound, like a far-off woodpecker. But as time passed, the noise got louder, more rhythmic, almost like someone was tapping a stick against the trees. It was coming from deeper in the forest, just outside the light from my campfire. I tried to focus on the fire, telling myself it was just some animal, but my eyes kept drifting toward the shadows where the sound was coming from. I couldn't ignore it for long. The tapping kept going, and now it felt like someone was hammering something into the ground, over and over, slowly. My heart started to race, and my hands were sweaty. Every time the noise stopped, the silence stretched on for what felt like forever, before the tapping started again like a slow, deliberate rhythm. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and decided to check it out. The light cut through the dark trees, the beam shaking a little in my hands. The noise was louder now, closer. I pushed through the thick bushes, trying to see where it was coming from. The ground was disturbed, like someone had been walking in a straight line, dragging something heavy behind them. The dirt was torn up in a way that didn't make sense. The farther I went, the more uneasy I felt. There was nothing ahead of me, just trees, vines, and mud, but I could feel the weight of the forest around me, like it was closing in. The noise seemed to come from just beyond the next set of trees, but when I looked, there was no one there. No footprints, no sign of life, just the dark jungle. I stopped, trying to calm my breathing, and just as I did, the sound stopped. Complete silence. I quickly turned around and made my way back to the camp, my heart pounding. As I walked, I heard something else. Footsteps. Not just any footsteps, but heavy ones, moving fast, like someone was running just behind me through the thick brush. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to run, but I was already too deep in the jungle. The darkness felt too thick, too suffocating. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I forced myself to move, fast, to the safety of my camp. The footsteps kept pace with me, following me every step of the way. My legs burned, and my mind raced. The jungle seemed to stretch on forever. Just as I reached the edge of the camp, the footsteps stopped. I ran into my tent and slammed the flap shut behind me. My breath was ragged as I sat there, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The jungle outside was silent now, but the stillness felt wrong, like the forest was holding its breath. The small light from my flashlight flickered, casting shadows on the walls of the tent. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me from just outside, waiting. I stayed in the tent, not daring to move, listening to every sound, every rustle in the bushes. The feeling of being watched never left. I kept my flashlight on, even though the battery was running low, and kept my eyes on the entrance. I didn't sleep a wink that night. When morning finally came, I was so relieved to see the first light filtering through the trees. I packed up quickly, not caring about the mess. I just wanted to leave. As I walked down the trail, I saw the marks on the dirt where I had followed the disturbed ground last night. The tracks were deeper now, like something heavy had been dragged through the forest. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the unease in my chest wouldn't let go. When I reached the end of the trail, I thought I saw something in the distance, something moving in the trees. I couldn't be sure, but it felt like something was still following me, just out of sight. My gut twisted with fear, but I forced myself to keep walking. As I passed the last tree line, I glanced back. There, just beyond the trees, I saw something or someone. A figure crouched low, almost hidden in the shadows. It didn't move. It just watched. And that's when I realized whatever had been following me last night wasn't gone. It had been waiting for me to leave. It had been watching me the whole time. I didn't look back again. My pace quickened as I got to the road, the jungle now feeling more dangerous than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting for the next person to wander too deep. Something that wouldn't stop following until it got what it wanted. I swore to myself I would never come back, and I never did. I never thought I'd be camping with my ex-wife again, but after all these years, she reached out and suggested we get away for the weekend. She said it was a way to clear the air, put everything behind us. I wasn't sure about it, but I agreed. She wanted to camp at the same spot we used to go when we were married, deep in the woods by a river, far from any road or houses. The place was just how I remembered it. Quiet, surrounded by tall trees, with the river flowing in the distance. We set up the tent, built a fire, and sat down to relax. As the night crept in, The cool air and the crackling fire brought back memories of when we were here together, but something didn't feel right. There was a kind of heaviness in the air, like the woods themselves were holding on to something dark from the past, something we couldn't shake off. As night fell, the camp was surrounded by nothing but darkness, except for the weak light from the fire. The wind picked up, and the trees started groaning and swaying. But it wasn't the wind that made me uneasy. It was the feeling that we weren't alone. I kept hearing sounds, rustling in the trees, footsteps in the brush, and it felt like someone or something was watching us. I tried to tell myself it was just the forest playing tricks, the usual animals moving around. But this felt different. The sounds weren't random. They were too close, too controlled. I stood up and looked around the trees, but saw nothing. Still, the feeling didn't leave me. It stuck with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. I stayed near the fire, trying not to seem too anxious. Around midnight, the rustling came again. This time, it was louder, closer. I froze, my heart beating faster. These weren't just the normal sounds of animals. It was too heavy, too deliberate. Someone was walking out there, avoiding the branches, moving with purpose. I could hear the slow steps, like whoever it was didn't care if we knew they were there. My stomach dropped. I slowly moved closer to the tent, trying not to make a sound. Then I heard it, a thud. It was quiet at first, but clear enough that I knew something heavy had hit the ground behind the trees. I turned to my ex-wife. Her eyes were wide, locked on me, and I could tell she had heard it too. The noise was getting closer. My heart was pounding in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight from the bag, turned it on, and swept the light across the trees. The beam cut through the dark, but there was nothing, just more darkness. My instincts were screaming at me to pack up and leave, but I didn't want to panic her. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or some other wild creature passing by. Suddenly, the fabric of the tent behind me shifted. I turned around, flashlight in hand, ready to fight if I had to, but it was just the wind. The tent had flapped in the breeze, but the unease in my gut wouldn't go away. I knew something wasn't right. We stayed up all night, too scared to sleep, listening to every snap and crack of the forest. Every noise made us jump. It wasn't until morning that the sound stopped. I felt exhausted, my body sore from staying awake all night, but I wasn't sure if I was relieved or still too afraid to believe what I had heard. We broke camp early, packed up in silence. The walk back to the car felt endless, like the forest was swallowing us whole. The trees seemed to close in on us with every step. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been right there with us in the dark. I didn't know what it was, but it felt too real to ignore. As we finally reached the car and drove off, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching us leave. But there was nothing, just trees and silence. I told myself it was all in my head, just the fear messing with me. But deep down, I knew something was out there. The thing that scared me most wasn't the noises or the footsteps I heard in the night. It was the thought that whatever it was still out there, still watching, still waiting. And maybe it wasn't done with us yet. Maybe next time it wouldn't be content just to stay in the shadows. I've always liked the quiet when I go camping, especially when I'm alone and in unusual places. So when I found a small, hidden graveyard deep in the woods, I thought it would be the perfect spot to camp out. The air was cool, the trees were thick, and the only sounds were the wind blowing and the occasional rustling of animals in the underbrush. I set up my tent near an old stone wall that ran along the edge of the cemetery, not too close to the graves, but still close enough to see the old headstones. I thought no one would bother me here. After all, who would want to camp out in a graveyard, especially at night? I spent most of the day walking around the woods, lost in thought and enjoying the peace. When night started to fall, the temperature dropped, and I lit a small fire near my tent. The flames flickered, casting long shadows across the graves, and for a moment, I felt a little uneasy. But I told myself it was just the quiet and the dark, nothing to be scared of. I ate a quick meal, then sat by the fire watching the glowing embers. As the night went on, I started to hear things. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe branches moving, but then I began hearing footsteps. Not like the usual sounds the wind makes, but the clear crunch of gravel on the old path through the cemetery. I froze. I looked around, but there was no one there. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the footsteps kept coming, slowly, steadily, right outside my tent. My heart started racing, and I felt a lump in my stomach. I grabbed my flashlight, pointed it at the noise, but all I could see was the dim light reflecting off the weathered graves. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing except the sound of the fire crackling and the distant call of an owl. I sat there, listening carefully, waiting for any sign of movement. I felt silly, but I didn't want to ignore it. I kept the light on the graves for a while, hoping it would somehow help me figure out what was going on. Then I heard it again, the crunching, but this time it was louder and closer. Someone, or something, was walking near my tent. I held my breath, hoping it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. But the sound didn't go away. It kept moving, circling me. My heart pounded in my chest. I shined the light outside, trying to see anything, but I couldn't make out any shapes. Nothing moved. It was like the world had gone completely still. And that's when I realized something was wrong. There had been no sounds earlier. No animals. No wind. Nothing. Now, it was so quiet, it felt like I was the only living thing in the world. I felt like I was being watched. I packed up my things fast, deciding I couldn't stay another minute. But as I gathered my stuff, the feeling of being surrounded only grew stronger. My hands were shaking, and I could barely catch my breath. I stepped out of the tent, shining the flashlight in all directions. Still nothing. I began walking toward the edge of the graveyard, trying not to panic. But the footsteps followed me, soft and slow, just behind me. I turned around, convinced something was following me, but all I saw was the dark. The road I had walked in on felt farther away, like it had moved while I wasn't looking. I kept walking, faster now, hoping I could just get out of the graveyard, but the silence felt even heavier. It was like something was waiting, watching, as if the whole place was holding its breath. Finally, I reached the edge of the graveyard, but there was no road. No lights. No street signs. The road I had come in on was gone, swallowed up by the thick woods. I spun around, my heart racing, and tried to figure out where I was. My flashlight flickered and went out. I was lost. Panic started to rise in my chest. I tried to retrace my steps, but the path I had come on was gone, like it had never been there. The trees all looked the same, and I couldn't tell where I had walked before. I stumbled over rocks and roots, trying to find some sign of the road. It felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. My body was shaking, and I felt cold and sweaty at the same time. Then, through the trees, I saw the outline of a building. It was an old, abandoned shack, and I rushed toward it, hoping someone might be inside or at least it would give me shelter. But when I stepped inside, I realized it was boarded up. There was no way in, no way out. The small shack felt like a trap. I sat in a corner, trying to calm my breathing, but the fear never left. The footsteps had stopped, but the dread hung in the air. By the time the sun finally started to rise, I could hear the faint sounds of traffic in the distance, like I was waking up from a bad dream. I hurried out of the shack and found the road I had come in on. My mind was racing, but I didn't stop until I was safely out of the woods and back to my car. I never went back to that graveyard. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear those footsteps. They circled my camp that night, slow and steady, like they were waiting for me to make a mistake. I never saw who or what it was, but I know it's still out there,